Welcome to the first session of Mission West 2022 Cooperative Governance Workshop Series. In this series, we take a look at what makes for a good governance within a cooperative and look at different governance approaches that co-ops can use to achieve their goals. In this first session, we're looking at what makes good governance. Looking at the definition of governance, as well as what things to be thinking about as we are assessing and choosing the governance approaches for our particular organizations. So what is governance? Well, governance today defines governance as the system or systems by which an entity is controlled and directed. And the International Standards Organization defines it as a system by which an organization makes and implements decisions in pursuit of its objectives. Both of these definitions are fairly broad, and for good reason. One reason is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to governance. Different organizations will, and even different parts of organizations will have different governance needs, and different governance approaches will be better suited to in different scenarios. This doesn't just apply to organizations overall, but also portions of organizations may actually use different governance approaches. In this session, we're going to focus a little bit more on some of the key terms in these definitions, better defining what it means to control, to direct, to make and implement decisions, and what elements there are in those actions, because those are fairly ambiguous terms, for lack of a better way of saying it. So some key elements of governance, the controlling, the directing, and the making of decisions is focus, which is what are you making decisions about? What are you controlling? There's the decision, which is how are decisions being made, including what is the discussion or information collection process that happens before the decision is made. There's implementation. How do you go from that decision to, or from the intention to real world results? And then there's accountability, which is focused on what happens if things don't work out. I want to pause here for just a second to recognize that accountability can mean accountability to implement, as well as accountability for a decision. They're two slightly different things. In this case, we're talking about accountability for the decision, not for the implementation. So it's a little bit like if you're being accountable for implementation, you're accountable if you're making dinner and the steak burns. If you're accountable for the decision, it doesn't matter how good the steak turned out if you were making dinner for a vegetarian. So those are two different forms of accountability there. So we're going to go through each of those key elements and kind of dive into them a little bit more. For focus, some of the key pieces are how are issues raised or identified? If you're trying to decide what you're going to decide about, you have to identify the issues. We all know that in our lives, in our organizations, there's 1,023 different things for you to be paying attention to, and there isn't time, space, energy, resources to actually pay attention to everything that's out there. So we have to figure out how we're going to identify and raise issues up for discussion and decision making. What gains our attention? There's lots of different ways of doing this, but it's important to be thinking through how your particular organization is going to do it. Who's going to get to add issues to the agenda? Is it going to be a board president that just creates the agenda 20 minutes before the meeting and you go through it and nobody else has a say in the agenda? Is it board members are going to be able to weigh in a week ahead of time? Are you going to have a public comment period where the public can bring up issues? Or are you going to have a consensus-based organization where at the beginning of each meeting, you do a round robin to see what issues are percolating for folks? Are you going to have a complaint process where your customers or your workers and staff can escalate issues to the board or to the decision-making body? So these are all different ways of raising and identifying issues, and each one has pros and they have cons. And so it's up to your organization to kind of work through what those are for your particular organization. As we get further into the workshop series, you'll hear about different approaches and hear how they've worked in real life situations and how they tend to play out across kind of the broad spectrum of experience. We're also in this category of, you're also looking at how are issues prioritized. You can raise a lot of issues and bring them to awareness and know that, you have a pipe that's leaking, or you're almost out of staples, or that your rent is coming due and you don't have a budget yet for it. There's all sorts of issues that can come up, and some of them are going to have to be backburnered. The focus issues being raised and identified as just building awareness of them. And there's often the saying of what gets measured gets managed. That's a way of measuring, is a way of making ourselves aware of it. But then we have to prioritize which decisions are we going to focus our attention on and make decisions about. So as a very relevant example for me right now, I'm aware that it's dinner time. My tummy's starting to rumble. I'm aware that that's going on, but I'm also aware that I'm in the middle of a recording and doing a presentation, and it's not really a good time to start putting food in my mouth, because that'll make the presentation really hard to understand. So I am going to prioritize the presentation and make that decision to focus my attention on making that good, and then later I will focus on dinner. Similarly, in your organization, you may prioritize focusing a decision on something that's urgent and really needs to be taken care of now, over something that can be deferred until later. Or you may prioritize doing a strategic planning session so that you are able to kind of guide those more urgent processes more efficiently and effectively. So that's a way of, and there's lots of different ways of prioritizing as well. You can have different people weigh in. You can have the board president decide which things are going to be prioritized. You can have a membership vote, all sorts of different ways of prioritizing what you're going to be focusing on. The second element that we're going to be focused on tonight is decision. How you make decisions matters in your organization and is a key factor in governance. And oftentimes it's the one we focus on the most. But there are pieces of the decision making, including how is the discussion managed? Is it that the loudest person speaks up and they get to say, have their voice heard, and somebody who might not be comfortable speaking up is unable to do so? Or is it that you provide space for peer-to-peer conversations pairing off and then bring it back to the whole group? Do you have space for people to just do individualized thinking? Do you do a round robin so that everybody makes sure their voices are heard? so there's lots of different ways of managing discussion. And again, as we get further into the workshop series, we'll hear about some of those in more detail. But another question is just how are decisions made? A lot of us are familiar with majority rules voting. We can, 51% of the people say yes, that's the decision we go with. Sometimes we swap that around and we say 60% or 100%. But there are other ways of doing it as well. It doesn't have to be a yes or no vote, straight up or down. It could be something like a fist of five or a ranking system where we can actually rank different decisions at the same time rather than going through each one saying yes or no. Or it can be a ranking system where we're just sharing a rating for a particular decision that's 0 through 5 or 0 through 10, and then it needs to go over a certain threshold of the summation of those ratings to move forward. So lots of different ways of making decisions, and different decision-making processes are better for some things and not for others. So as you're thinking about it, that's another piece of the puzzle to be paying attention. Another piece is also, how is dissent handled? So most of your decisions will not be unanimous in one way, shape, or form. And you have to decide how is dissent handled. In a lot of spaces, it may be handled where the majority rules, the minority goes along with it because they were outvoted and you're still speaking with one voice. In other cases, dissent has a veto, and maybe that veto has parameters put on it so that a veto has to come with some evidence-based reasoning behind why the veto is there. It can't just be, I don't feel like it. It could be that dissent means that that person is no longer part of the organization. And again, it's going to vary widely based on your organization's goals and values, as well as the particular topic being decided upon in that moment. And then all of these are kind of wrapped around this idea of who is included in or excluded from the decision-making process. Oftentimes we talk about inclusion and exclusion in kind of this moral framework where you want to include as many people as possible and exclusion is not a great thing. But there are cases where exclusion is actually a really vital part of the decision-making process. If somebody has a conflict of interest, for example, you're going to want to be able to provide a way of excluding them from at least some aspect of the decision-making process so that conflict of interest doesn't impact the decision. But you also want to be thinking about who you are excluding from that more equity focused lens. Are you excluding people who are impacted by the decision in a way where they don't have power over the decision and they don't have power over what is happening to them? Are you, in thinking about inclusion as well, are you including people who have expertise in the decision that you're going to make, so that they may not be a voting member on this decision-making process, but they may be part of the discussion beforehand to inform the decision, to make sure that the decision is as informed as possible. So these are all things to be thinking about as you're deciding your decision-making process. And again, it may vary. For something with a legal matter, you may want to include an attorney. If you're discussing branding and designing your website, a lawyer may not be necessary in that inclusion process or in that decision-making process. So it'll vary who's included, who's excluded, based on what you're focusing on in those moments. And now we're going to move on to implementation. And so implementation is focused on how do you move from decisions to reality? And this is important because in a lot of cases, our decisions, our board may form a policy, but if that policy is not communicated or enforced, there have been cases where lawsuits have been successful, saying that that policy was not actually there because there was no enforcement or communication of it. So just making a motion and passing a motion in your board meetings isn't enough. There has to be an implementation process. So here, as you're thinking about that, you want to be thinking about how are your decisions communicated. That can be happen in a wide variety of ways. That can be an email to all staff or everyone that's impacted by the decision. That could be posting it in a public place where folks can see it. That could be placing it in a policy manual that is revised and folks are expected to read through. That could be talking to people one-on-one about it. It really is based on the culture of your organization and how best you communicate with the people that need to be communicated about that decision. Another thing to be thinking about, we talked about the policies not being enforced, not just not being communicated, but not being enforced. So accountability mechanisms are essential. And those are going to vary widely because decisions can be about both what we do and what we don't do. And so accountability mechanisms around what we do can be punitive. They can be, you do this or something happens to you. If it's a staff policy, you do this or you get a write-up, or you have your pay docked or something else. If you can have fines for board members that don't align with a policy, but it can also be there are positive accountability possibilities with what we do as well. It can be recognizing that folks are going above and beyond or doing what they said they were going to be doing, and calling them out, rewarding that behavior. Excuse me. And then policies for what we don't do as well. That it's harder to have positive accountability on that front. And you may need some enforcement mechanisms for if you have a social media policy that prohibits folks speaking on behalf of the organization through their social media accounts. So those are things to be thinking about. Another thing to be thinking about is, in terms of implementation, is how adaptive are the decisions to a changing and complex world. You don't want to create decisions that are so rigid that as soon as they hit the real world, they're no longer viable. Some examples from my personal experience. I was a board member of a local nonprofit just before COVID hit, and COVID dramatically impacted our budgets, especially the line items in our budgets. We had some areas where we weren't spending, no one was traveling, so we had all this travel budget that we weren't using. And then we also had our service side, where we're providing services to the community, and suddenly we needed to provide a whole lot more of that service, and so that budget category skyrocketed. Luckily, we were flexible and we were able to take the money from the travel and bring it over to the service side, but that had to go through our board, and so it did take a little bit of time. Whereas if we had been able to, if beforehand we had been more adaptive in our policies and said, our program managers have leeway to move money around up to a certain percentage in order to handle some unforeseen circumstances, we would have been able to provide those services a little bit quicker. Another example might be tying your mileage to the federal mileage rate, rather than taking that mileage rate and placing it in the policy as a static number, simply saying that your mileage rate is going to be X% of the federal rate, or something along those lines. That way you don't, as inflation occurs or as other things happen, you don't have to go back and update that policy every year or however frequently it needs to happen. And that gives you more capacity to tackle some of the other issues that might arise while still maintaining a policy that is more up to date and reflects the realities that people are living with. And then the final aspect of all of this is that you want to be thinking about as you look at your governance approach is who's responsible, is accountability. So who's responsible if things don't work out or if there are unintended consequences. In a lot of cases, the board is responsible, but that may not always be. Maybe the membership ends up being, as a whole, may be responsible for something. And that may be, the board may delegate the decision-making to a committee, but the board itself may be still be responsible. So it's important to think through that process in order to make sure that the board is actually comfortable with that delegation, and to set up that delegation so that the responsibility, that those who are making the decisions bear some responsibility for the decision, so that you don't have that disconnect where because as folks are less responsible, then the risk taking may exceed the overall risk that the organization is comfortable with. And so who is responsible is one frame, and it is one form of risk, but there are other forms of risks to be paying attention to as well. I've been in organizations where they were trying to be very egalitarian and everybody was in on the decision-making process, but one person owned all of the land that this organization was run on. And so if they did something that had a negative consequence to the valuation of the land, that landowner was assuming all of that risk and not anybody else. There may also be risks to people who aren't in the decision-making process at all. So if you're a co-op and you're serving your customers, you may create some risk to your customers. Maybe it's crowding in some tables into a restaurant, or making decisions about a food safety plan. There's going to be risks associated with that may not be borne directly by the organization. And so you want to be thinking about how that plays out further down the line. So I kind of rushed through this, but I am open to any questions, or if folks have particular examples or ideas that came up for them as we were walking through this, I would love to hear that.